Good morning.
Good morning.
In 1 Thessalonians, we read, "Pray without ceasing." The parable that we're reading today from Luke has that instruction. In American rhetoric, the parable is saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So listen for it. Jesus says that this relates to prayer. Luke 18, 1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for the people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my accuser." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly judge. He will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?"
Good morning, people of God.
Good morning.
Good morning, beloved people of God.
Good
Do
morning.
you know you're beloved? Well, you're not going to answer that question. I will answer for you. Yes. So I am honored to be here with you this morning. I was so grateful when Doretta invited me. And I have a question for you. Do you know what a conference minister is?
No.
If you do, raise your hand. Wow. 2 people, 3 people, usually 4 people. Usually I get no people and raising their hand. So conference minister kind of oversees all the churches. What does that mean? 143 churches, you gotta be kidding me. It means that I am committed to partner with you in relationship to be all that God intends for you to be. And that's true of all the churches of the conference. I also do other stuff, manage the staff and all that stuff. But my main focus is to be the consultant and the caretaker and the help for the churches to be all that God intends them to be. And I'm also the pastor to the pastors. So if anybody asks you what a conference minister or this conference minister does, there it is in a nutshell. And I hope I can be with you more after the service in the coffee hour. That would be wonderful. Now, I know that you're a people of deep faith. You know how I know that? You talk so lovingly with each other before the service. I just see your eyes light up. You enjoy being here. You're not here because I didn't have anything else to do, and the football games aren't on until later. You're here because you want to be. And even if you're not sure whether or not you want to be, you're here anyway, because God has bidden you to be. This is a time in the life of the church, not just this church, but all churches, a time of transition. A time of not what it used to be. We're not what we used to be. I would imagine there was a time when this beautiful sanctuary was filled. That's not what happens anymore. And we could talk more about why that is, but that's not part of my sermon. And we don't quite know where God is leading us. And that is true of all churches in the United States, certainly all churches in our denomination. And it could be a time of uncomfortability. It could be a time of a little bit of, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And yet, transition can be a unique, rich time to wonder, who are we, and to whom do we belong, and what does all that mean? And it very much ties into this Sunday of Advent, which is joy. Joy is not happiness. Happiness is based on happenstance. If things are going well, you're happy. If things are not going well, you're not so happy. Joy is the deep well of knowledge that you are loved and cared for, no matter what's going on in your life. That's what this Sunday of joy means. That God brought love and steadfastness to everyone, whether they're happy or not. So my message to you this morning, beloved, is to hold hope alive. We had hope at one time, 2 weeks ago. To know joy as you wait for God to figure out where you're going. And to know also the peace that passes all understanding that seems pretty hard to come by in this world of ours. And during this time, there are essential questions that we all have to ask ourselves that will shape each of the futures of the churches in Maine and all churches across the United States. Who are we? And to whom do we belong? What is our history that has brought us here thus far? Your pastor tells me that this church burned down in the early 20th century, right? But then you built it up to look the same. And you saved the pump organ. That is really cool. Somebody must have carried it out. What do we celebrate about ourselves today? What do you celebrate about being congregation that you are today? And what do we hope we will become? Who are the persons, the people who we serve beyond the four walls? Those people who need us more than we need them. Do we want to expand that service in some way or change it? Now this is a long list and it can be overwhelming. And it's really hard to remember all the things that I've said, because if your memory is like mine, I forgot after the first question I asked. Maybe we can begin by asking ourselves the integral questions. Two essential questions. Who are we and to whom we belong? Do we belong? Who and whose? Perhaps the gospel lesson for this morning will shed some light on how to approach these questions. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. I like that. I like that a lot. So to put this passage into context, by the time Luke was writing this gospel, it was a generation or so after Jesus had died, and people were very discouraged in Luke's community. They thought that Jesus had told them that he was coming back right away. And they're going, wait, where is Jesus? He was supposed to come back. That's what we think he said. But keep in mind, Luke wasn't one of the original disciples. And by the time, 30 years later, what Jesus said was kind of morphed into other things and what people would wish that he would have said. But they were tired and they were beginning to lose hope for their future. They were in what they thought was an endless time of transition that would never end. So Luke presents a parable of Jesus to them, a story that illustrates the dilemma of a people who are in a waiting period, a parable that encourages people not to be discouraged and not to lose heart. It's a message to pray long and deep, and as you do, get to know yourselves and God to whom you pray, more clearly and more fully. At first, when you listen to it, sounds like God is saying to nag God. Nag, 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 nag. Has any of you ever nagged God? I know I have. With repeated requests when we're tired of waiting. So that God, like this judge, will eventually give in and give us what we want. Eventually. In this parable, we are relentless, and the judge is ruthless and not very loving. Now, sometimes in parables, Jesus uses the creative teaching method of presenting the opposite of something, or in this case, the opposite of someone, to make a point. My gosh, if this judge, who doesn't give a darn about anybody, including God, will give to this widow, how much more will God give to us? This judge is anything not like God. The only reason the judge gave the widow what she wanted is because he didn't want to be embarrassed. He didn't want to be bugged anymore. The reason God gives us what we ask is because God is the God of justice and compassion. So Jesus is teaching us something very important about the nature of God and maybe something about who we are. Using the example of a widow to hound the judge is very, very important because widows were down at the bottom of the rung of the culture at the time, down there with orphans. So Jesus is saying to us, no matter what our lot in life, we are beloved. And Jesus listens. And Jesus gives what we need, although not always what we want. But who is this God? Well, in the Gospels, Jesus depicts God as a God of creation. God made us. But not only that, God continues to make us and create us over and over again. Jesus depicts God as a lover who values us more than we can imagine and yearns to free us from our fears so we can live and love more freely. This is a God who truly loves us unconditionally. We can't push God away and we can't bring God forward because God's right there. God is a guide, Jesus says, who nudges us into the fullness of all we can become. God is a consoler who holds us when we grieve, whatever losses we suffer. An encourager to keep going and trust that your future holds hope and goodness and greater things than we can ever imagine. That's what we read about God in the Gospels, and also in the Old Testament as well. So Jesus also gives us clues about who we are, and see whether or not this resonates with you. We are God's people engraved on God's heart. Engraved on God's heart. It says in Isaiah, we are in the palm of God's hand. Any of this reverberating yet? We are children in whom the desires and intentions of the heart of God to show compassion, justice, inclusion, and embracing welcome for all around us. Does that reverberate? We are a people that loves God fully and loves others as God loves us. Do we belong to this God of total love and justice? And how do we know? Jesus seems to be telling us in this passage that we know through conversation with God, but not only one conversation that's persistent and never-ending, that's continual and determined. It's conversation that doesn't give up. Several years ago, deep within the news coverage, like one of those stories you have to dig for, there were terrible events happening in Myanmar. You might remember that. And a BBC reporter shared the story of Matita, a writer and doctor who was held in solitary confinement for 6 years after she wrote against the abuses of the government there. 6 years. When asked how she survived those long years of waiting and suffering, she described her spiritual life. The reporter said that as a Buddhist, Marita meditated 18 to 20 hours a day. Can you imagine that? The reporter cited her deep engagement with Buddhism. Sometimes we have to wonder, how many of us Christians are as deeply engaged with Christianity? Jesus wanted his followers to do more than pray as a habit or as a requirement or just asking for what they want. Jesus told his followers to pray constantly. And Jesus went off and prayed a lot. What if we engaged with God, prayed so to speak, not just once in a while or when we're in need, not just in a ritualized fashion in worship or in the morning or at meals or at night, but how about all the time? What does that mean to pray to God all the time? Asking God to reveal God's self within us and all around us all the time, deep within our hearts, in the beauty of nature. Got a lot of beauty here in nature. How about in a book of Psalms or a poem? In the laughter of children, in the eyes of a friend or a lover. What if we dedicated ourselves to get to know this God, and in the knowing we get to know ourselves, and in that knowing we get to know the hope that God has for us as we go into the unknown future? What if? Those 18 to 20 hours a day of meditating must have had an incredible effect on Marita, on shaping her spirit, keeping her alive in both body and spirit. Perhaps it helped her to remember who she was in the midst of unspeakable circumstances. Now, we don't know what it means to be tortured at the hands of torturers, but we know what it is to be in transition. We know what it is to have loss. We know what it is to be in pain. And what if we engaged with God all the time? Will that help shape our spirits? Because our prayer life can shape our spirits as well. It can help us to remember who and whose we are. It helps us to align our intentions with the intentions of God as we look to the future. Where this church will be in the next 5 or 10 years. Where we will be in the next 5 to 10 years. Do you trust that you are God's own as the members and friends of Waterford Congregational Church? No matter who you are or where life has led you? If you don't, you need to pray that you can and you will, because you are. Can you trust the same God will accompany you every step of the way along your personal journey, along your church journey, along your family journey? I love Kierkegaard's analogy of faith or trust. Kierkegaard says it's like floating on a deep ocean of 70,000 fathoms of water. If you struggle, if you tense up and flash about, you'll eventually sink. But if you float, if you relax and trust, you'll float. Trust that with God and in God, you will always float. In every circumstance of our lives, in grieving and loss, when we don't feel happy, we can know the joy of being in God's water floating. In anxiety and uncertainty, where are we going into our future? In a time of transition, as we all are in right now, who are we? We are God's own, my friends. Whose are we? We belong to the God of our hearts, to the God of our creation, to the God who fills our whose ocean we float. The God who accompanies us every step of our journey, no matter who we are and who we will become, no matter where life has brought us thus far and where life will lead us from here.